I'm got late. This is chapter 2. We're on page 15. Yet, for some reason, JonBenét was instead carried downstairs to the basement and subjugated to the tortures of a pedophile. One of the male suspects was determined to carry through with his team's vengeance, ransom money be damned, and remained in the home as his partners departed to resume their surveillance on the neighborhood from their outside posts. This was the act of a deranged baby killer to whom Patsy would refer to during her CNN interview on January 1st, 1997. "Keep your babies safe," she admonished viewers, for there was a baby killer on the loose in Boulder. The monster's final act of cruelty was determined to be the ultimate causation of JonBenét's death. The pedophile tied a ligature around her neck and used it to strangle the last bit of life from her tiny body. Petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes indicated that she was still alive when strangled. As further insult, the perpetrator believed to have inserted the broken end of the paintbrush used as a handle in the garrote into her vagina at near the time of her death. Death was ruled by the coroner to be a homicide by asphyxiation, and the time of death was later estimated to have been at approximately 1 a.m. on the morning of December 26, 1996. The target of his abduction, now deceased, was placed on the floor of the wine cellar. Monster. He stood over the unmoving and before him, and he tried to understand his feelings. Nothing. He felt nothing. Scanning the room, he observed a set of the window screens along one wall and a couple of wrapped Christmas presents standing against another. Curious, the wrapping had been torn away at the top ends of each present. Monster. Took one look around and exited the room, carefully latching the door behind him. Unbeknownst to him, he had left behind an impression from the poon of his high-tech boot in the mildew on the floor next to JonBenét's body. Another clue left behind for investigators to contemplate. Radio transmissions from his partners encouraged him to leave the residence, but Monster wanted to see and hear the reaction of the family when they discovered the disappearance of their daughter. This was no longer about money, but cruel and unusual vengeance. The hours of the night slowly ticked by, and eventually the monster heard the telltale signs of an awakening family in the floors above him. He eventually heard Patsy scream out for John and listened as they discussed the ransom note and debated calling the police. He listened to Patsy's near-hysterical telephone call to 911 and settled back into the shadows of the basement when he heard the voices of the first police officer arrive on scene. It was not long thereafter that a uniformed sergeant swept through the basement, missing him in his darkened hiding place. The light of dawn was slowly beginning to creep its way through the basement windows, and monsters could make out the voices of the additional police officers arriving at the scene. Yet another police officer ventured into the basement and, shining his flashlight here and there, passed by the monster in his hidey hole. He was flushed with excitement as the officer returned upstairs and then began to hear the voices of the family who had been summoned to console Patsy. And then, some period of time later, a third person came through the basement calling out JonBenét's name as he looked around. This man was not a uniformed officer, but he spent some time inspecting the area around the train room window well, and Monster began to worry that his route of escape might have been discovered. His heart nearly burst when the man unlatched the block of wood securing the wine cellar door and then stepped inside. Surely the girl's body would be discovered by this activity. But the man had apparently seen nothing, for he soon relatched the door and reluctantly climbed the stairs back to the kitchen. Monster felt he had seen and heard enough. He had successfully eluded the observation of 3 people who had been through the basement that morning, and the voices of those on the floor above him suggested that the house had been filling and growing with a number of people. It was time to get out. He moved to the window well and stood upon a Samsonite suitcase that had been used to help his partners leave the basement earlier that morning. Prepared to leave, he began to carefully leverage himself into the window well and then froze. Movement in the window directly across from the grate caught his attention, and he observed John Ramsey standing in the den not more than 15 feet from where he hid. Craning his neck to get a better view, he saw John speaking to a female. It wasn't anyone Monster recognized, but it dawned on him that it must be a police detective. She held in her hand a small tape recorder and a handset of the telephone. Damn, he thought. Ramsey would be stationed in the den to receive the ransom call, and he couldn't possibly escape in full view of all the windows that faced the backyard from that room. Monster climbed back down out of the window well and cursed as he accidentally scuffed the wall behind the window with his foot. With a growing sense of panic, he began to consider his options. After several minutes, he decided to venture up the stairwell to the first floor, nearing the top of the stairs. He again froze in place. A toilet had flushed. He listened intently as a water faucet was turned on and off, and the door was shut. It was apparent that somebody had been using the guest bathroom located near the top of the stairs. Cursing himself for not doing a better job memorizing the floor plans of the house, Monster remained in place, listening for additional sounds that would alert him to the presence of another person. There is a butler door somewhere near the top of those stairs, he thought. All I have to do is make it to that door, and then I'm home free. Monster inched quietly towards the top of the stairs, knowing that any instant another person could emerge from the doorway and enter the basement. His damp hand clenched a semi-automatic pistol in readiness. His heart pounded in his chest, and his ears searched for the telltale sign that anybody was nearby. Peering beneath the crack of the door, Monster decided to make his next move. He lightly grasped and then turned the doorknob. By millimeters, the door slowly edged open, and a distant sound of voices opened up to him. They seemed to be coming from the far side of the house. Stepping across the threshold of the door, Monster swore beneath his breath. Which way is it? This place is a goddamn maze. Monster turned away from the voices and crept along a short hall. He was about to turn the corner when a police radio crackled so close that he could almost feel as though he was standing on top of it. He dared not to peek around the corner, for the radio hung from the belt of a CSI processing the door for latent fingerprints. The team in the compact vehicle had pulled back to the Chautauqua Park, located several blocks away from Baseline Road. Daylight was now in full bloom, and they were now growing not only impatient but alarmed. They had watched as a number of marked and unmarked police cars had visited the Ramsey home over the course of the morning. None had carried their companion away in handcuffs, so they were presumed he still remained hidden somewhere in the home. What in the hell was he thinking? Protested the female. Suddenly, there was a break in radio silence. The Monster whispered his predicament and to his partners on the outside. It was agreed from their positions of surveillance, they would They would track as best they could the movement of the police officers and other people in the home and advise Monster when it might be possible for him to escape the home. It was decided that no ransom call would be made, and perhaps that they would give cause for John Ramsey to leave the den and the police to retreat from the home. The female started up the car and decided to make another pass by the home. It only took a minute before she pulled up to the stop sign at the intersection of Cascade and 11th Street, a few blocks southwest of the Ramsey home. Another vehicle slow in her direction caught her attention. "Get down," she said urgently to her partner. He quickly slumped down in his seat and out of view of the passing vehicle. Her face darkened as she tracked the movement of the passing car. She made a quick right turn and drove away from the neighborhood. "Okay, you can get up now." The male passenger pulled himself out of the footwell and peered through the rear window. What was that? There was an unmarked police car. The passenger was videotaping all the license plates of cars parked on the street. Monster had moved back to the train room in anticipation of receiving the all-clear signal to go. Well, this is from his partners outside of the home. He paced back and forth in a tiny space and then set a chair blocking the threshold of the doorway to the room. Anyone wishing to enter the room after him would have to move the chair and thereby alert him to their presence. It was risky, but it would give him a moment to be prepared to face any additional visitors who might come to the basement before his escape. Time seemed to stand still until there was a radio transmission blurting into Monster's earpiece. "John Ramsey is in Burke's bedroom. He's scanning the street with a set of binoculars." Monster knew that this was his best opportunity to escape, and he quickly stepped onto the suitcase and climbed into the window well. As best he could, he peered into the windows of the den and at the rear entry door just feet from the grate. He could see no one, and he slid the grate forward and he was rapidly out of the window well. 2 seconds to replace the grate, the monster sprinted for the back alley of the house. There was no shouts of alarm or police officers yelling at him to freeze. He continued his sprint to the north end of the alley and then slowed to a walk. Glancing in both directions and seeing no one, he crossed the street and continued up the next alley. Eventually, he circled around to the van and quickly climbed into the side door. His partner greeted him with open arms. "No police calls on the scanner. I think you got away clean." Monster leaned back wearily and caught his breath. He glanced around the interior of the vehicle and grabbed a plastic bag. Pulling a remainder of the polymer cord from his pocket, he stuffed it, the stun gun, the roll of black duct tape, and the practice pages of the ransom note into a bag and cinched it closed. Taking a quick look around before stepping out of the van, Monster moved to the trash can behind Barnhill residence and deposited the evidence of the crime into a container. Several moments later, the van moved off through the alley and the trash can slowly receded from view as Monsters turned at the next block, smiling. He turned to his partner. "It never hurts to have a patsy ready to take the fall for you." The misleading clues left behind by the members of the foreign faction were confusing and puzzling and ultimately sent some investigators flying away on the tails of wild geese. I couldn't read the whole thing. I had just gotten up. It was the day after Christmas and we were going to go visit, and it was quite early in the morning, and I just got dressed and I was on my way to the kitchen to make coffee. And we have a back staircase from the bedroom areas, and I always go down that staircase, and I usually am the first one down. The note was laying across just 3 pages across the run of one of the stair treads, and it was kind of dimly lit. It was just very early in the morning, and I started to read it, and it was addressed to John. It said, "Dear Mr. Ramsey," and it said, "We have your daughter." And I know it's just wasn't registering, and I may have gotten through another sentence. I can't. "We have your daughter." And I don't know if I got any further than that. I immediately ran back upstairs and pushed open the door, and she was not in bed, and I screamed for John. This is Patsy Ramsey's description of finding the ransom note during a CNN interview, aired January 1st, 1997. Chapter 3, Kidnapped. It was the nearing shift change at the Boulder County Regional Communications Center in the early morning hours of December 26, 1996. Having worked most of the holidays, dispatcher Kimberly Arugula was looking forward to spending the next few days off with her teenage son. Day shift relief dispatchers were coming into the center, receiving their briefing on the night's events when the light of a 911 call console lit up Archuleta's station at 5:52. She took the call and immediately sensed the urgency of the hysterical woman of a female on the line. A hush came over the center, and the coworkers turned their attention to Arugula as she repeated the words of the 911 caller that a 6-year-old girl had been kidnapped. We all know that call. I will put that in your playlist. I don't have time for Patsy's shenanigans. Okay. Officer Rick French was the first to arrive on scene at 5:56 hours. Oh, yeah. I just read military time and then it just gets jumbled in my brain. So at 5:56 a.m. and was greeted at the front door of the residence by Patsy Ramsey. John Ramsey was visible from the front door, standing in the kitchen at the end of the length of the hallway that ran toward the end of the house. French observed John Ramsey to be dressed in a long-sleeved blue and white pinstripe shirt and khaki pants. Patsy Ramsey's hair and makeup appeared to be neatly done, and she was dressed in a red sweater and black slacks. Mrs. Ramsey immediately stated that their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét, was missing from her bedroom and that a ransom note had been found indicating that she had been kidnapped. John Ramsey directed French to 3 pages of paper spread out on the floor on the back kitchen hall. Mrs. Ramsey told French that she had stopped by JonBenét's bedroom at approximately 5:45 a.m. when headed downstairs that morning and found her daughter was not in her room. She had come across the note as she proceeded down the back spiral staircase to the kitchen. She stated that she had originally found the 3-page note spread on the bottom treads of the stairs, but that her husband had moved it to its current location on the floor of the hallway just outside of the kitchen. French was told that Patsy Ramsey had immediately called 911 after showing the note to her husband, and he advised French that the house appeared to be locked as it had been left the previous evening. An alarm system for the house had not been used in some time, and they reported hearing nothing unusual during the night. Ramsey told French that he had conducted a cursory search of JonBenét's room and that of his 9-year-old son's while awaiting for the arrival of officers. He reported that his 9-year-old son, Burke, was still asleep in his upstairs bedroom. He had not been awakened by either the parents to determine if he knew anything about JonBenét's disappearance. French rechecked JonBenét's bedroom with John Ramsey and noted that the bedding had been pulled back as though one would be getting in and out of bed. There was no sign of struggle in the room and no sign of forced entry into JonBenét's locked second-floor balcony door. It looked like a typical room of a 6-year-old. Sergeant Paul Reichbach was the night shift patrol supervisor and finished up the night's paperwork at his desk when he overheard French dispatch to the Ramsey home. He immediately headed for his car and was the second officer to arrive on scene at approximately 6:10 a.m. French met Reichbach at the front door and gave him a quick briefing, telling him that there was a ransom note and that he believed that there may have been a kidnapping, but something didn't quite seem right to him. Many years of dealing with people under stress and at the peak of their emotions often give peace officers a sixth sense, and something was beginning to tickle the edges of French's radar screen. Reichbach had shown the ransom note on the floor, and reading it, he began to formulate a response plan to the kidnapping. The note had specifically stated that the family was being watched. It seemed unlikely that a kidnapper would be parked outside of the Ramsey home watching for police activity, but it wasn't unreasonable to think that they would be monitoring police radio frequencies. So Reichbach ordered a radio silence for the remainder of the call. Any further communication between the officers working the case would be conducted by cell phone. He called on the resources of the on-duty and off-duty crime scene investigators, notified Sergeant Robert Whitson, the on-call detective supervisor of the kidnapping, and requested that victim advocates respond to the scene to assist in comforting the family. Reichbach also took steps for the telephone company to set up a trap and trace on the Ramsey phone so that the source of any incoming phone calls for a ransom could be traced. While French remained with his parents, Reichbach conducted an interior inspection of all 3 floors of the home, including the basement, and he did not notice any credible point of entry that drew his attention. He noted that the far end of the basement was a white door secured at the top by a block of wood that pivoted on a screw. Reichbach tried to open the door, but stopped when it was apparent that it would not have been at either point of entry or exit from the home. During his inspection of the second floor, Reichbach observed the door to Burke's bedroom that was open and the lights were off. He moved quietly into the room and Burke appeared to be asleep beneath the covers of his bed. Exciting. I bet last time Burke was excited about anything. Okay. Exiting, Reichbach closed the door nearly all the way to prevent the downstairs noise from awakening the boy. Following a walkthrough of the home, Reichbach then conducted a cursory search of the exterior and observed frost on the grass and a little bit of snowfall on exposed areas of the lawn. He noted that no one other than himself had walked through these areas. Reichbach noted that no snow had adhered to the rear patio and walkways. The driveway was wet, but no footprints. Tracks were visible, and he observed no fresh signs of forced entry to the exterior doors and the windows. After hanging up on the 911 dispatcher, Patsy Ramsey found the composure to make 2 additional phone calls. Family friends John and Barbara Fernie, as well as Fleet and Priscilla White, were hurriedly summoned to the home. She told her friends that there was an emergency and that she needed them in her home. She had not told them that John Bonet had been kidnapped and that she needed their support. It was near 6:30 a.m. when the Fernies arrived, and from the outside rear kitchen patio door, John Fernie was able to observe the ransom note still spread out on the floor of the hallway next to the kitchen. Not long thereafter, Fleet and Priscilla White were the next family friends to arrive at the Ramsey home. Fleet White reported that within approximately 15 minutes of his arrival, he made a quick inspection of the basement of the home. He was purportedly the 3rd person to visit the basement at that point in the morning. It should be noted that White's daughter, Daphne, had gone missing about a year earlier, but she was eventually found hiding in their home. Despite the existence of the ransom note in this instance, he took it upon himself to check the basement for JonBenét. He is the only person on record who called out her name as he searched the home that morning. White observed a window to the train room to be closed and unlatched, and was immediately drawn to the area. A particular upper left quadrant of the window was broken, and it was large enough, about the size of a baseball, that a person could just reach through the space and unlock the window latch inside. Sections of fractured glass were missing from part of the window, and he inspected the area closely for the remnants of those pieces. He moved a hard-sided Samsonite suitcase that was standing beneath the window to look for broken glass. He didn't find any. The larger pieces of glass pane had already been removed, and it was subsequently determined that John Ramsey had broken the window and entered through that space when locked out of the house the previous summer. The glass from the breakage had been cleaned up, but the window had never been repaired. White did find a single kernel of glass on the floor, an apparent remnant from John Ramsey's earlier entry. He placed this on the ledge of the window frame, leaving the window in its original condition, moving on to complete his survey of the basement. White then moved from the train room to the white door of the wine cellar room, unlatched the wooden block, partially opened the door to that room. Unable to locate a light switch for the windowless room, White failed to see the blanket on the floor that wrapped the body of JonBenét. White returned upstairs and subsequently suggested that Burke be sequestered to the safety of his own home in the company of his son, Fleet Jr., and visiting family. Reports are conflicted as to whether or not White's accompanied John Ramsey to awaken Burke. Ramsey reports that he alone awakened Burke and told him to get dressed and that his sister was missing. French made an attempt at an interview before Burke left home, but was told that the boy had been asleep throughout the entire event and that no information was available to offer officers. There is no dispute that White alone subsequently drove JonBenét's brother to the residence located in West Boulder. Before leaving home, Burke grabbed his Nintendo game, and he was gone by the time Detective Linda Arndt arrived at 8:10 a.m. The exact timing of events is not clear, but French was purportedly the second person to inspect the basement after things had stabilized at the scene. He reported that he had briefly checked the garage and back doors of the residence not long after his arrival, and he had gone to the basement sometime before the arrival of the civilians at the home. Much has been made about his failure to discover the body of JonBenét in the wine cellar during this walkthrough, but like Reichbeck, one must understand what was going through his head at the time. This was not a situation where a child was merely missing and possibly hiding in a home. The family reporting a kidnapping of their child, and he had been shown a ransom note as proof. French was checking the interior of the home for a possible point of entry and exit and would have been used by a kidnapper. The door to the wine cellar was secured by a wooden block, and it showed no sign of having been forcibly entered from the exterior. There simply was no reason at that time to go into that room. CSI Carl Veitch arrived on scene and handled the collection of the ransom note. It had been replaced and photographed on the stair treads as had been the original location of discovery, according to Patsy Ramsey. He then transported the note to the police department and photocopied it for investigators before securing it and going home sick. Reverend Raul Halverstock of the family St. John's Episcopal Church also responded to the home that morning, and he, along with the family friends, attempted to console a visibly distraught Patsy Ramsey. He was arriving at the home as Veitch was departing with the ransom note. CSI Barry Weiss and Sue Barklow, had arrived on the scene and began to look for a possible point of entry into the home. They examined doors and windows and began to dust for latent fingerprints. Wise observed that the balcony door of JonBenét's bedroom was closed and locked. He noted that it had been a very cold night and observed the light coating of frost on the exterior bedroom balcony floors and railings. There was no marks of disturbance visible on the balcony prior to his testing of the surface. Crime scene photos depicted before and after photos of the balcony floor with his footprints in the frost. Anecdotally, another officer reported that the outside temperature had been observed to be 9 degrees Fahrenheit 1 hour earlier to Tebu Plaza, approximately 5 miles distant from the Ramsey home. Victims' advocates arrived on scene at approximately 6:45 a.m. as CSI processed the scene for latent fingerprints. They reportedly followed the CSI around cleaning up the messy fingerprint powder and unwittingly destroyed additional trace evidence that may have been discoverable. Notification of the abduction had been made to Sergeant Robert Whitson, the on-call detective supervisor for the holiday. He confirmed that the mechanics for installing a trap and trace on the Ramsey home phone had taken place. He called out detectives Linda Arndt and Fred Patterson and sent them to the home. Undercover narcotic unit detectives were called out and instructed to maintain surveillance for suspicious people and activities taking place within the neighborhood. He directed that a senior command staff page be initiated and alerted the DA's office, the Boulder County Sheriff's Department, and the city's public information officer of the investigation. Whitson also contacted the Denver Fields offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they immediately began consulting with the Boulder police on the investigation. Whitson subsequently responded to the home and spoke with John Ramsey. He briefed him on the investigative steps to be taken by the department and advised Ramsey on the FBI's involvement. Ramsey reiterated his belief that the house had been locked the previous evening when his family had returned in for the night. Upon request, Ramsey provided Whitson with handwriting samples of both he and his wife. He grabbed a notepad from the kitchen area, and he apparently knew to contain samples of his wife's handwriting and wrote a sentence on another pad of paper as his own exemplar. Whitson asked Ramsey about any suspects that came to mind, and he mentioned a former employee at his company, Jeff Merrick, who had left under difficult circumstances. Linda Hoffman Pugh, the family's current housekeeper, who was also named, and this was due to a recent request for a monetary loan from his wife. JonBenét's bedroom was secured with crime scene tape during Whitson's visit, and he subsequently returned to the police department with the handwriting exemplars. These were turned over to Detective Jeff Kithcart and the department's forensic frauds handwriting examiner. Later that day, around the time of the discovery of JonBenét's body, Kithcart made an unsettling discovery. He observed handwriting on pages of Patsy Ramsey's notepad that started out in similar fashion to the opening words of the ransom note. The structure of the letters was similar to those of the ransom note, and pages had been torn out of the pad. It appeared to Kithcart that Patsy Ramsey's notepad may have been used to construct a practice ransom note. Detective Linda Arndt brought recording equipment with her to the scene, and not long after her arrival at 8:10 a.m. She was determined that she would use the den as her base of operations. She asked French to remain with Patsy Ramsey in the first floor solarium as she briefed John Ramsey on what to say to the kidnappers when they called. French continued to attempt to control the movement and activities of friends who were now inhabiting the home. Arndt conducted a brief interview with Patsy Ramsey that morning and was told that she too thought that the house was locked the previous evening. Mrs. Ramsey reported to Arndt that she had found the ransom note first before going to JonBenét's bedroom, and this conflicted with what she had reported to French when he first spoke to her that morning. She related possible suspicion of Linda Hoffman Pugh due to her recent request for $200,000 in a loan. Arndt was subsequently told by Father Rawl and Patsy Ramsey that Patsy Ramsey also wanted her to know that Hoffman Pugh had previously mentioned concerns about the kidnapping of JonBenet. A copy of the ransom note was brought back to the house that morning by Detective Arndt, and the family and friends attempted to decipher its contents. Some thought the ransom demand of $118,000 an odd amount for a ransom demand. They also thought the amount ridiculously low and knew that John Ramsey was well and capable of paying of upwards to $1 million. And a ransom note if his daughter in ransom for his daughter if necessary. The length, content, and details provided by the kidnappers in the note immediately raised questions for the investigators who were working the case that morning. The FBI consulting in the case had never seen a ransom note of its kind. In their experiences, ransom notes were short and sweet and typically provided few details about the perpetrators behind a kidnapping. Additionally, the note began by formally addressing John Ramsey. By its end, the kidnappers spoke as though they were intimately familiar with John and his family. They got scans of the note. Page 36. None of the civilians on the scene that morning seemed to question or to be concerned about the length of the note. Arndt noted that John Ramsey seemed to be distracted throughout the course of the morning and was out of the den at least on 3 occasions during the time frame when they awaited for the ransom call. He had to run and answer the phone when it rang. The ransom note stated that the kidnappers would call with instructions for the family between 8 and 10 a.m., and the passage of this time came and went without any observed comment from Ramsey. It wasn't long after this that Arndt lost track of his movements. She reported that she first made note of his absence at around 10:40 a.m., and he didn't reappear until noon. Nearly 1.5 hours would pass before John Ramsey explained this absence. CSI had wrapped up their processing of the first floor of the home. Victims advocate Grace Marlock and Mary Lou Gedimus had followed them around, cleaning up the mess left by fingerprint powder. Family friends were still in attendance, continuing to attempt to console Patsy Ramsey, and had used the kitchen to prepare food and snacks for the group. French had remained at the home throughout the morning and observed additional behavioral clues that tickled his sixth sense. For one, Patsy Ramsey had wanted him to remove his gun belt and uniform shirt as he stood in the house. He thought it was an odd request since he was protecting the family against members of a foreign faction who had entered her home and already kidnapped her daughter. Why was she so uncomfortable with a uniformed police officer being in her home? There was another peculiar moment that captured French's attention. Patsy Ramsey had been crying throughout the morning and was being consoled by her friends. At one juncture, he observed that she had her hands up around her face, presumably to help cover her anguish. He was a little unnerved when he discovered that she was peering at him through her fingers. It was an odd moment that left him uncertain about what to think of the circumstances in which he found himself immersed. Supervisors and detectives had convened at the police department following the passage of the ransom hour, and Arndt found herself to be the sole police officer remaining in the home. She had observed a marked difference in John Ramsey's mood when he had resurfaced at noon. He was anxiously pacing around the house shortly before 1 p.m., and in an attempt to keep his mind occupied, Arndt suggested that he check the house from top to bottom for anything unusual. Rather than follow the directions of the detective, Ramsey immediately led Fleet White to the basement. White was interviewed on 3 different occasions by law enforcement authorities about the events that followed his visit to the basement with Ramsey. He told investigators that John Ramsey had led him directly to the train room, and White told Ramsey about his visit to the room earlier that morning. Ramsey related his break-in through the window from the previous summer, and they both checked around for more glass. It was not clear from either of the men's later interviews whether they had opened the window as they looked for more glass, but Ramsey stated that both men had gotten down on the floor to check for signs that the window hadn't been broken again. Preparing to leave the room, they moved a fireplace grate to check another closet, and Ramsey then moved out of the room and down the hallway towards the wine cellar. White was replacing the grate when he heard John Ramsey cry out, "Oh God." White stated that he rushed down the short hallway and joined Ramsey just as the latter flipped on the lights in the wine cellar. He could now see a partially wrapped body of JonBenét. He leaned down and touched her bare ankles, which were visible from outside of the blanket. He later told investigators that they were cold to the touch. White left Ramsey in the wine cellar and ran upstairs shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Ramsey stated that he removed a piece of duct tape that was covering JonBenét's mouth and also removed a cord that had been tied around her left wrist. He then carried her upstairs and was greeted at the top of the stairwell by Detective Arndt. Arndt, alerted to the events by White shouting, saw Ramsey emerge from the basement, carrying JonBenét upright and away from his body. JonBenét's arms projected over her head, stiff from rigor mortis. Arndt instructed Ramsey to place JonBenét on the floor, and then she checked for vital signs. JonBenét's lips were blue and she was cold to the touch. Arndt could not find a pulse, and she noted an odor of decay. It was apparent that she had been dead for some period of time. Arndt then picked up JonBenét's body and moved her to the living room, laying her on her back on a rug in front of a Christmas tree. Barbara Fernie and Priscilla White had been with Patsy Ramsey in the solarium when they heard Fleet shouting for an ambulance and moved from the room. Patsy did not accompany them. Arndt and John Ramsey stood face to face over JonBenét's body, and he was told that she was gone. She then directed him to call 911 since they had no radio with her to contact her dispatch center, and then to go to his wife. Ramsey left and returned approximately 2 minutes later, and before Arndt could stop him, he grabbed a blanket in the room and placed it over her body. Someone else placed a sweatshirt over JonBenét's bare feet. Not long thereafter, Patsy Ramsey was led from the solarium, supported in the arms of her friends, where she collapsed on her daughter's body. Despite being instructed by Detective Arndt to stand guard at the top of the basement stairs, Fleet White returned briefly to the wine cellar during these events. He picked up the duct tape, touched the blanket that had been wrapped around JonBenét's body, and handled a cigar box in the room. Father Rawle was leading the group in prayer when White returned upstairs. Patsy Ramsey was hysterical, wailing for Lazarus to raise her daughter from the dead. Acting Detective Division Commander Sergeant Larry Mason arrived on scene at 1:20 p.m. and was accompanied by Denver FBI Supervisor Agent Ron Walker. They had learned of the discovery of JonBenét's body while meeting on the investigation at the Boulder Police Department. Mason directed the evacuation of the home, now considered to be a crime scene in its entirety. Both he and Walker were reported to have inspected the wine cellar before leaving the home. At approximately 1:40 p.m., Detective Bill Palmer overheard John Ramsey speaking on the phone and making arrangements to fly to Atlanta that afternoon or evening. Upon the conclusion of the phone call, Palmer told Ramsey that he couldn't leave town and he would need to stay to assist in the investigation of the murder of his daughter. The nature of this call was passed along to Mason, and he too spoke with Ramsey about leaving town. John Ramsey reportedly told Mason that he had to leave to attend a meeting he couldn't miss. Sergeant Mason eventually convinced the father of the murdered child of the necessity of remaining in Boulder. Fleet White and John Fernie had spoke to one another about where the Ramsey family would go now that their family home was being secured by police with a search warrant. It was agreed that the Fernies would make room for the Ramseys at their South Boulder home. As the Ramsey family and friends were departing the home at approximately 2:15 that afternoon, a taxi pulled up that contained John Ramsey's older son and daughter from a previous marriage, John Andrew and Melinda Ramsey. Melinda's fiancé, Stuart Long, was in attendance. John Andrew and Melinda Ramsey. Melinda's fiancé, Stuart Long, was in attendance. Ramsey broke the sad news of John Bonet's death, and the family left for the Fernie residence. The kidnap of John Bonet by a foreign faction had now become a homicide investigation. Let's get it. Chapter 4, Homicide. Boulder police received a lot of criticism for having lost control of the initial crime scene, but they were soon playing catch-up to rectify the situation. What followed was one of the most thoroughly investigated homicides this country has ever witnessed. The home had been sealed following Sergeant Mason's orders to evacuate the residence, and officers were posted to ensure the integrity of the crime scene. Investigators gathered at the police department to strategize the next steps. Detective Division Commander John Eller cut short his vacation and, leaving visiting family from Florida at his home, responded to the police department to direct the investigation. FBI Supervisory Agent Ron Walker spoke to Eller briefly before leaving the department. Local authorities were responsible for investigating murder, and the police no longer had concurrent jurisdiction for kidnapping. "You need to look at the parents," he told Eller. "Statistically, about only 6% of child murders are committed by strangers. The percentages drop significantly when a child is found murdered in their own home." The veteran FBI agent reiterated that the parents had to be considered in the investigation of the death of this little girl. Detectives and officers who had the opportunity to ask questions of John and Patsy Ramsey that morning before the discovery of her body had a general outline of what had occurred the previous evening of Christmas Day. They had been told that the Ramseys had attended a dinner party at the Whites' residence on Christmas evening and returned at around 10 p.m. John Ramsey reported that he read to both his children before retiring for the night and that he had been the one to tuck John Bonet into bed. It was related that both parents had thought that the house had been locked before they went to bed that night, and John Ramsey had actually inspected the doors before retiring. No keys had been lost or stolen, and the only other people who had keys of the residence were Patsy's mother, John's eldest son, John Andrew, and the housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh. Patsy's mother and John Andrew were both reported to be out of state for the holiday. The family dog, Jacquees, was in the custody of the neighbor, John Barnhill, who lived across the street from the Ramsey home. The family was headed to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan, early on December 26th, and the dog would remain at its second home in Boulder. The officers were aware that Patsy Ramsey's versions of finding the ransom note had changed. She initially told French that she had stopped by JonBenét's bedroom on her way downstairs that morning. JonBenét's bed was empty, and she proceeded downstairs to find the note on the bottom of the spiral staircase at the rear end of the kitchen. Patsy Ramsey had then told Detective Arndt that she had found the note first, returning to the second floor bedroom of her daughter, and then discovered her missing. There would be additional inconsistent statements to come in the following months. Detective Kithart had discovered what appeared to be a practice ransom note on a pad identified as belonging to Patsy. Written in black on a felt tip pen were the following words: Mr. and Mrs. I. The I appeared to Kithart to be the downstroke of a pen that would start to be the capital letter R. He felt the investigators needed to look for additional handwriting exemplars and pens that may have been used to author the note. Commander Eller appointed CSI Mike Everett as the lead technician responsible for directing the collection of physical evidence from the scene. Another investigator was assigned the task of writing search warrants affidavits for the home, and consideration was given to obtaining warrants for the home of Linda Hoffman Pugh, the housekeeper, and John Ramsey's office. After several rewrites of the affidavit as directed by the DA's office, investigators finally returned to the Ramsey home to continue their processing of the scene. The seal of the front door was broken at 8:36 p.m. on the evening of December 26, 1996. CSIs carefully worked their way through the residence, videotaping the premises before any additional processing took place. 35 millimeter still photographs were taken that evening as well. JonBenét's body had remained in place where Detective Arndt had placed it in the living room earlier that day, and Boulder County Medical Examiner John Mayer accompanied investigators to the scene that evening to personally oversee the removal of her body. An autopsy to determine the cause of her death would be undertaken the following morning. It had been a long and emotionally draining day. Investigators concluded their work for the night and resealed the home at approximately midnight 21. Boulder's residents would learn of the crime the following morning. This is from the Daily Camera, December 27th, 1996. Missing girl found dead. A 6-year-old Boulder girl reported kidnapped early Thursday was found dead in her parents' home later that afternoon. It is Boulder's first official homicide of 1996. Police detectives and crime scene investigators began searching the home late at Thursday after securing a search warrant. No details of what they found were disclosed. Although the official cause of death has yet to be known, Police Chief Tom Kobe said the case is considered a homicide. The child had not been shot or stabbed, said Detective Sergeant Larry Mason. No arrest has been made as of time of press. The police has no suspect, Mason said. The Boulder County Coroner's Office refused to discuss any details on the case, though an autopsy will be performed today, according to city's spokesperson, Leslie Aho. The child was 1995 Little Miss Colorado and a student at Martin Park Elementary School, according to a family friend. Patsy Ramsey traveled around the country with JonBenet to attend her daughter's beauty contest. They were so serious about this beauty queen stuff, and they never put any pressure on her. She was Little Miss Colorado in 1995, and Dee Nelson Schneider, said Dee Nelson Schneider, a family friend. Okay. CSI Everett and the other investigators would return to the home on the morning of Friday, December 27th at 9:25 a.m. and resume their search for evidence. During his exploration of the premises, Everett observed spiderwebs approximately 10 inches in length on the southwest edge of the window grate that covered the train room window well. These were attached to bricks, rocks, and the foliage near the grate. He noted that the foliage near the grate didn't appear to have been trampled or disturbed. CSI would continue to photo document their exterior search of the residence, though unfortunately, the spiderwebs described above were not photographed in detail. Also, a triangular-shaped cobweb attached to the lower left window frame of the train room window well was photographed by 35mm film and video. During their initial process of the home, the wine cellar was examined in detail, and investigators noticed the imprint of a boot in some mildew on the floor next to where JonBenét's body had been concealed. It was from a high-tech brand hiking-style boot, and there appeared to be another partial boot shoe print impression nearby. The poon of the boot was insufficiently distinguishable for comparison purposes, however. More specifically, there was nothing in the label of the boot impression that would help match it to another boot because of the wear pattern or other irregularity. Its presence in the cellar could only illustrate that at some point in time, perhaps days or months prior to the discovery of JonBenét's body, somebody wearing high-tech boots had stood in that room. CSI would make another important discovery during the search of the home. Broken shards of wood from a Korea paintbrush handle would be found on the floor outside of the entrance door of the wine cellar. A portion of the matching handle was found in the paint tray near the door, and this would eventually be matching the broken wood handle used in the garrote that had killed JonBenet. It appeared that the garrote had been constructed at the entrance of the doorway of the wine cellar, and investigators believed that JonBenet's murder had taken place in that very location. One additional odd piece of physical evidence would be discovered sitting in plain view on top of the kitchen counter. Standing upright amidst food articles, a black Maglite brand flashlight, similar to the type used by police officers, had been observed by the CSIs processing the crime scene. There was no identifying marks on the flashlight, and no officer who had been present at the scene claimed ownership. CSI collected the flashlight as possible evidence. It was processed for latent fingerprints inside and out, but nothing could be lifted from its surfaces. The Ramseys would later indicate that they may have owned a similar style of flashlight and stated that it had been kept in a kitchen drawer. It had been given to them by John Andrew, but the fingerprint powder depicted in the photograph of the flashlight alters its appearance in a way that it apparently threw off the identification of the gift. John Fernie and the housekeeper Linda Hoffman Pugh would subsequently identify the flashlight as belonging to the Ramsey family, both having seen it in the home before the kidnapping. The presence of the flashlight on the kitchen counter was never fully explained. It would later be identified as a possible weapon used in the blow to JonBenet's head. Investigators and CSIs worked throughout the day collecting and tagging numerous items of potential evidence. They would return again the following morning and continued to process the home for evidence for 10 days straight, having sought additional search warrants over this period of time. While CSIs carefully worked their way through the Ramsey home, Eller had detailed a team of police officers to the around-the-clock security at the Fernie's residence, and they were on site not long after the Ramsey family took refuge in home of their steadfast friends. Heeding the FBI's advice, he wanted to know what the family was saying or doing in the aftermath of the discovery of JonBenet's body. In the interim, following the autopsy of JonBenet, Sergeant Mason was tasked with attempting to arrange an interview with the family members. There were a number of questions that the investigators had not been able to ask of John and Patsy during their wait for the ransom call. He and Detective Arndt visited the Fernie home, the temporary quarters for the Ramsey family, on the evening of Friday, December 27th, in an effort to schedule more detailed interviews. Family friend Mike Bunham, a former Boulder County prosecutor, was present and apparently provided legal advice to John Ramsey's. John Bonet's pediatrician, Dr. Francisco Booth, was also present. He refused to let Patsy be interviewed. She was under the influence of medication and described as being too distraught to even consider responding to the police department to answer questions about the murder of her daughter. Mason and Arndt left the Fernie home the night empty-handed, unable to secure a firm date and time to follow up with an interview. The following morning, Saturday, December 28, 1996, investigators were notified of the Boulder County Assistant District Attorney Pete Hofstorm that the Ramsey family was now being represented by attorneys. Any questions of the family regarding the circumstances surrounding the death of their daughter would have to be put in writing and presented to Hofstorm to their legal counsel. No face-to-face interviews between Boulder police investigators and the Ramsey families would be scheduled for months. This is Chapter 5, Cause and Manner of Death. Detective Tom Trejo and Linda Arndt were tasked with attending John Bonet's autopsy, which began early on Friday morning, December 27, 1996. A handful of people stared down at the small body bag on the examining table that contained the remains of a 6-year-old girl. Present within the cramped spaces of the morgue's autopsy theater were the representatives from the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder County Coroner's and District Attorney's offices. Each of the men and women present attempted to mentally prepare themselves for what was about to come. The cold act of dissecting the lifeless body of a child was something you never become accustomed to, and child homicides in Boulder were a rarity. It is difficult to put aside the thought of a child laying on an examination table, that it could be one of your own. The stench of death never seems to leave these particular environs, invading every pore of your body, and having been there before, you sadly realize that it may take days for the distinctive odor of the morgue to fade away from memory. The visual aspects of this type of work, however, rarely leave your consciousness. Eventually, the coroner's office began the process of removing the custody seal that had secured the body bags the previous evening. The small bag containing John Bonet was unzipped, pulled away, and she was gently placed on the examining table. She was observed to be wearing several pieces of clothing that indicated a white long-sleeved knit shirt bearing a star of sequins on the chest, a pair of 12 Bloomers brand underwear, and a pair of long underwear type pants. They all watched as Dr. Mayer removed loosely tied pieces of white nylon cord that remained attached to John Bonet's right wrist. Her father had already removed the loop that had encircled the left wrist when he had discovered her body. Dr. Mayer noted that the loop was loose enough that he could place his fingers between the cord and John Bonet's wrist. The length of the cord between the loops had been placed around her wrist was determined to be approximately 15.5 inches, and both ends of the cord were frayed. The loops on the cord had been tied so loosely around John Bonet's wrist that there left no telltale marks or abrasions on her skin. Another piece of similar-looking cord was embedded in John Bonet's neck. The loop around her head was determined to be configured with a slip knot, with a trailing end leading from the midline of the back of her neck and wrapped around the splintered stick. The stick measured approximately 4.5 inches in length, and both ends were splintered. The word Korea was printed on the stick. The trailing end of the cord extended approximately 4 inches beyond the slip knot at the end of the cord was frayed. The length of the cord departing from the portion of the slip knot encircled JonBenét's neck to the stick measured approximately 17 inches. The end of the cord that had been wrapped around the stick was observed to be burned and melted. The cord around her neck was situated in a horizontal fashion with a slight vertical cant as it reached the back of her jawline. The position indicated that the cord had been applied manually and was not consistent with the death caused by a vertical hanging. Hair from JonBenét's head was entangled in a slip knot, and it appeared that force had been applied by the pulling at the end of the cord with the wrap stick, embedded the cord into the flesh of her neck. Dr. Meyer had to clip some of JonBenét's hair to free the ligature from her neck. The stick was later determined to be a portion of the broken paintbrush handle found in an art tray near the entrance of the wine cellar. The slip knot was situated at the rear of her head, so it was presumed that JonBenet had been facing away from her perpetrator as they had tightened the noose around her neck. Dr. Meyer carefully cut, marked, and removed the garrote from JonBenet's neck. The remaining furrow, and dark red in color, revealed how deeply embedded the cord had been buried into the flesh of her neck. An examination of her eyelids and the conjunctiva of her eyes revealed the presence of petechial hemorrhaging pinpoint blood vessels that had been burst when JonBenet had been strangled. These hemorrhages indicated that JonBenet had been alive when the garrote had been applied and tightened around her neck. A triangular-shaped bruise was observed on the front of JonBenet's throat and below the line of the embedded cord. It was approximately the size of a quarter and located left of the midline of her throat. Dried mucus from her nose had been smeared down the right lip and cheek. Marks from the straight edge of the duct tape had once been placed over her mouth appeared visible, suggesting that the mucus had already been in place before the duct tape had been applied. There was an orange-red colored rectangular mark on JonBenet's right cheek, beneath her ear and jawline and the undermined organ. Paper bags had been secured over JonBenet's hands before she had been removed from the living room of her home the previous evening. These were removed, and the fingernails of each hand were carefully clipped into envelopes with the hopes that DNA of epithelial cells or trace blood evidence would be there to help identify her attackers. A heart drawn in red ink was observed in the palm of her left hand. JonBenet's clothing was removed and bagged for collection of other trace fibers and evidence that may be present. Obvious items for trace evidence, fiber hair, were collected from the clothing before they were removed from her body and bagged upon removal. The underwear and long johns were observed to contain dried yellow-colored urine stains in the underwear that contained 2 small circular stains of blood in the crotch. The location of the urine stains were to the front of the clothing, and it was thought that JonBenet had been lying on her stomach when her bladder let go at the time of her death. The examination of the outer skin of her body revealed some minor scrapes, abrasions, and marks. Located at the top of her left shoulder were the signs of scrape marks. Her lower left leg had another abrasion that was thought to be a scratch mark. On the lower left quadrant of her back were two distinct red marks upon closer inspection Dr. Meyer identified as abrasions. They appeared similar in size and round in shape, measuring 3.5 millimeters in distance from one another. At one point during this process, investigators decided to stop their examination of JonBenét and considered the possibilities of fingerprinting her skin. Several telephone calls were made to the other agencies in an attempt to determine whether it was a successful method for retrieving latent fingerprints from the skin of a deceased person. They weren't able to determine if there was any tried or true technique that would be successful. But they did try a technique that involved the use of magnetic powder, a specific type of fingerprint powder that utilized a magnetic brush to move and collect the powder over the surface believed to hold latent fingerprints. Investigators were not successful in lifting any latent fingerprints from JonBenét in this fashion. Dr. Meyer conducted an external examination of JonBenét's genitalia. He had observed spots of blood in the crotch of her underwear she had been wearing when her clothes had been removed, and this alerted him to the possibility that there was the cause for this evidence to be present. He observed that there were fresh trauma located at the 7 o'clock position of her He observed that there were fresh trauma marks located at the 7 o'clock position at the hymeneal opening. The area was inflamed and had been bleeding, and it appeared to Dr. Meyer that a foreign object had been inserted into JonBenét's genitalia at or near the time of death. The site of the damaged tissue was excised and prepared for a pathology slide. Later examination would reveal the presence of cellulose material in the membrane of the hymeneal opening. This was consistent with the wood of the paintbrush used in the handle in the cord of the garrote. He noted that he didn't consider this injury as a result to be particularly vicious assault with a foreign object. A very small splinter of material was discovered during the microscopic examination, and more trauma to the site would have been expected if the perpetrator had been intent on physically torturing the child. Dr. Meyer also observed signs of chronic inflammation around the vaginal orifice and believed that these injuries had been inflicted in the days or weeks before the acute injury that was responsible for causing the bleeding at the time of death. This irritation appeared consistent with prior sexual contact. An alternate light source, ALS, was used to scan JonBenét's body in search of other trace evidence and fluids. The area around her upper thighs illuminated traces of fluids and indications that she may have been wiped clean with some type of cloth. Investigators thought that the fluid source reacting to the ALS was semen's, but swabs of the area would later be determined it to be a smear of blood. Per autopsy protocols, Dr. Meyer collected tissue samples from a variety of internal organs, and this included the contents of JonBenét's stomach. He found no traces of food present in her stomach, but did collect remnants of what appeared to be raw pineapple from her upper duodenum of her digestive tract. Scientific examination would later confirm his preliminary opinion that JonBenét had consumed raw pineapple not long before her death. There had been no outward appearance of an injury to JonBenét's head. No trace of blood had been observed in her hair. The scalp did not reveal signs of any type of injury. So Dr. Meyer began his internal examination Investigators were surprised to learn that she had suffered a severe blow to the upper right side of her skull. A linear fracture covered the entire length of the upper right side of her head, from the parietal to the occipital bones of her skull. The injury was rectangular in shape, measuring approximately 8 1/2 inches in length by 1 3/4 inch to 1 1/2 inches in width, and the fracture bone from the skull had caused extensive damage to the brain below. Fresh subdermal hematoma was apparent, as well as subarachnoid hemorrhaging. There was